And so we look forward to the perhaps less distant day now when we will have no media in Ireland, no official media, no what they call mainstream media. I don't think that it can be any more than 5 to 10 years delayed that day in terms of print. Broadcast is a bit more complicated. It's up to us. Well, we could just stop paying the license fee and that would put it into that. And by simply asking that, requesting that, looking at our calendars, we note that depending on where you start out, the national broadcaster, whether it's you start back in, was it 1926 with a 2RN, or we go to 1960 with Telefish Éireann, or then we go, no matter where you start, there is no record anywhere of RTE having reapplied to the Irish people on the basis of asking them how did they feel about the way RTE was carrying out its remit, and therefore would like to ask them to renew the licence which the Irish people have graciously given to what calls itself the national broadcaster. That would be a great policy for a party to take up. That the first thing they would do in office would be to dissolve RTE and advertise a competition, inviting all comers to put in applications to become the national broadcaster. There's no good reason and no legal reasons that I know of to prevent this. And it is absolutely necessary from a democratic point of view. I started off in journalism in the 1970s, actually. I wrote my first article for Hot Press when I was 22. And I was down the west here, well, further down the west. This isn't the west, this is the Midlands, which Castlereagh is in the west. I hope this is clear, because there's a lot of confusion on this point, The Midlands is the place you pass through, on the way to the west. I was down there and I was writing for Hot Press, and then I came up to Dublin in '84 and I started to, and you see, Ireland at that time, now I'll probably put this wrong because some of you will disagree with me, but I would say Ireland at that time was a very exciting time in certain sense, culture, very exciting, because those of us who were young and interested in music and sport and TV and movies and all that, we had lots going on. And there was a very vibrant kind of culture opening up at that time. I think most of us at that time would have regarded ourselves as left-wing. I did anyway. Insofar as we regard ourselves as anything, we would have thought of ourselves as being left-wing. Because at the time, politically and religiously and culturally perhaps, official Ireland was a very stagnant place and perhaps a little monochrome and not particularly interesting, and the newspapers very much reflected that. So I got into alternative media, which by its nature tended to be left-wing, insofar as it was kind of soft left, really, not particularly ideological, because I didn't ever meet anybody, or very few people, who actually knew anything about socialism or Marxism or any of that stuff until quite a bit later on. But I went to Hot Press and it was a good place to work. It was fun. And I didn't really, at that time, really feel anything, I didn't feel in any way alien to what was going on. In fact, I felt a little bit alien, I suppose, to the mainstream of society, to Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael as being kind of very staid, middle of the road, unimaginative parties, which I don't think you can argue with. But I went to various newspapers, Sunday Tribune, and I worked for McGill magazine, editor of McGill magazine, and again that was very much, not very much left wing. It was more mainstream, but it was very Vincent Brown, I suppose you would say, with all that entails. And eventually I ended up in the Irish Times. And when I went into the Irish Times, the editor of the Irish Times, Conor Brady, said to me, he said, I want you to come in here and write for the Irish Times as you would have written for Hot Press or in Dublin or McGill. I don't want you to be writing like all the other drones in here, And I said, great, that suits me. So I said, what do you want me to do? He said, well, I have a great idea, he said. I want you to go down to the Midlands and write an article about 4 Midland towns. And he told me about the 4. And luckily, today I can tell this story because one of them happened not to be Athlone. Right? So it's safe enough to tell this in Athlone. Portlaoise, Tullamore, Mullingar and Longford. And I would spend about a week in each of them. And I didn't like any of them. And this kind of was reflected in the articles I wrote. Anyway, there was absolute consternation. The county councils of several counties had emergency meetings. There was a special sitting of Joe Duffy. And it was absolute. And the editor who came from Tullamore was deeply unhappy. But he didn't, because he had asked me to do this, he couldn't really throw me in. And, you know, so it was like one of those, I mean, if I'd written the same articles for Hot Press, nobody would have batted an eyelid. But because it was the Irish Times, it was like stratospheric. But anyway, that was grand. Up to that point, you know, the system was, you know, I'd write an article, there was no email, just bring it in, give it to the editor, go home. That was that. Very little comeback. Occasionally you would get a phone call from a sub-editor who were very punctilious fellas in those days. I mean, John Bamble used to be a sub-editor in the Irish Times, a Booker Prize winner. But a fellow called Godfrey Fitzsimons, who was a great tall man, and he was very severe. He was the chief sub-editor, and he would ring me up now and again, very severely, like a headmaster. He said, John, I'm just wondering about the semicolon in your second paragraph. Did you mean that to be a colon or a semicolon? Because, you know, there is a difference. And he would give me a little lecture on the difference and so on. You know? And this was all. So but this time, something started to happen. And that was that every time I brought an article in, a particular editor from the editor's, a woman actually, from the editor's office, no sooner would I be home, the phone would ring, and she would be on the phone, and she'd say, John, yes, I've got your article now, and it's very, very good. I really like it. I said, but there's just a couple of queries I have about it, you know, and would you go through it with me? So she would start at the first sentence. I said, who told you that? Do you think that's the best way you might put that now, John? So we'd work on the first sentence, and then we would move to the second sentence. And 3 hours later, she'd say, oh, that was great. And I'd be kind of wondering, well, what was it you liked about the article? And then, so this went on for months on end. Every article I brought in, until one day, the phone didn't ring. And I thought, my first thought was, she'd moved on. She's got another victim. And then I had a second thought, no. I'm now doing what they want me to do. I'm doing it to myself. Whatever I've done, I've learned how to not offend their principles, whatever they are, what their rules, their unwritten rules. So I'm now what the editor told me he didn't want me to become. I'm now just like all the other drones in there. So then I decided, well, what I have to do now is gradually push the boat out. And then that I did. And for the next 20 years, that's kind of what I did in the Irish Times. I'm getting myself into enormous trouble. Like I started off writing about the EU and Euro bullies, and I mean there was a little bit of stuff about that because this is the time of Maastricht in '92, and I ended up actually doing some meetings with the great Raymond Cotty, opposing Maastricht and around the country. And I remember actually being at a meeting in the RDS then. There was a open meeting of politicians who were pro and anti, it was advertised, but I couldn't hear anybody that was anti Maastricht. But I was there and asked a few questions of Peter Sutherland and generally just trying to start things. And then as it was wrapping up, a senior editor of the Irish Times who happened to be there also, who didn't, as far as I knew, like me or want me in the building, very kindly offered me a lift back to the office. And on the way, he started to say to me, John, the editor is very concerned. I said, really? I said, yeah. He says, some of the things you're writing, he's very worried. Really, very worried. Yeah, I mean, he says, I don't know, we can't really let it go on,